are flagship webinars created to spark energy club discussions and beyond. So, if you would like to explore the topics of energy and climate and be a part of our network, you will find the link for registration in the chat box below later in the session. In this episode, we will continue expanding our conversations within the energy climate nexus. Keeping track of this year's NDC 3.0 deadline, we are shifting our lens to how ASEAN countries are integrating sectoral targets into their climate commitments. And today, we are spotlighting a sector that shapes the daily mobility for millions of people and carries major potential for low carbon development, which is public transport. And we'll be exploring how public transport is reflected in ASEAN climate plans, the role it can play in reducing emissions, and why it is an important element in helping the region reach broader climate goals. So now that we have introduced ARNECC to you, I would like to introduce our host, Ms. Indira Pratnyaswari, Research Analyst of the ASEAN Center for Energy, who will lead today's discussion. We are also honored to have our guest join us today, Professor Indra Overland. He is the head of the Center of Energy Research at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, which is also our partner institution here at ACCEP. And he will be sharing his insights on our key topics. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask our guests during the session, please send them to the Q&A box below. So on that note, I would like to hand over the stage to Ms. Indira. Ms. Indira, please take it away.
Hi everyone. Thank you for attending this podcast. And actually, this is our third episode, and this will be a slight more different than the previous episodes because this is the combination between the ARNECC paper talk and the ARNECC podcast because we will be talking that not only talking about what's going on under the energy and climate nexus, but also we will also discuss the paper that recently published by Professor Indra Overland titled "Does ASEAN Climate Policy Pay Sufficient Attention to Public Transportation?" So welcome, Prof. Indra. It's an honor for us to having you in these episodes. For those who doesn't know yet, Professor Indra Overland is a research professor from NUPI, just as mentioned by Tania previously, and he has been working on the energy sector not only in Southeast Asia but in South Asia and Central. And yes, and yeah, and also part of our implementing partner on the ASEAN Center, ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project. So welcome, Prof. Indra. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to join the podcast. It's first time for me on this podcast, but I've listened to many of the other podcasts, so I'm happy to make a contribution now myself.
Yes, so thank you, Prof. Indra, for your time. And maybe before we explore more about your work, could you please let us know how did you end up researching in Southeast Asia? What makes you interested to explore Southeast Asia as your main focus of research?
Well, I've always thought that it's an amazing region full of amazing people. And because of its special geography, it's with so many islands and mountains, it's very varied. So that's one thing in general for Southeast Asia. And then when it comes to energy and energy transition and climate change, the ASEAN countries are incredibly important because there are 700 million people. But I don't think, they're like basically half of India or half of China, but I don't think they get half as much attention. They get less than half as much attention, but they are actually very important with so many people, high economic growth, continuing population growth, unlike China, and continuing quite rapid growth in greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So this makes the region pivotal for the global energy transition and for climate mitigation, and is why I decided to focus on it, in addition to liking the region.
That's interesting. And you also mentioned that that's how you get interested on the energy sector, right? And now that you also involved in one of our projects, the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Projects, and it means that ASEAN is also actively participating on the climate commitment, supporting the international commitment, Paris Agreement, and other climate negotiations in the international level. So, what do you think about that? How do you see ASEAN's participation under the climate commitment?
Can you repeat that? How do I see?
Yeah, how do you see ASEAN participations on the global climate commitment? Or maybe
Right,
can you give us,
right.
yeah.
So yeah, the ASEAN countries are very important for the global effort. And of course, with 10, now 11 countries with East Timor, there's a lot of variation. Some are small, some are big, some are richer, some are poorer, and so on. Some have a lot of fossil fuels, some don't. So they're important. There's a lot of variation internally, but overall, ASEAN has maybe not taken the lead in this area. So it's a part of the world which, I mean, there are many parts of the world which are not doing so much, and ASEAN is one of them. Whereas there are some, like China is doing a lot, and Europe is doing a lot, and Costa Rica is doing a lot, and so on. So there are some countries that really have managed already to do a lot, but ASEAN is not, although there's variation between the countries as a whole, on average, it's not moving that fast forwards on energy transition and climate mitigation. And that's also a reason why, another reason why it's so important to study and understand and to look for solutions and to communicate with people from Southeast Asia about the solutions and possibilities.
I see. And I've also read some of your papers that talking about not only the sector and also the climate sector. You've also mentioned the paradox of energy climate, if I'm not mistaken, on your publications, previous publications. And as we refer to that, we do notice that this year in 2025 is the submission of the third NDC or nationally determined contributions, and that we in here we also notice that not all NDC touch sectoral basis. For example, some NDC, especially ASEAN and some of the ASEAN NDC only mention the target and also the general action plan or roadmap without mentioning the sectoral contribution towards the greenhouse gas emissions. So what is your opinion about that? Do you think that the NDC should be based on sectoral basis so that it would be clearer for the country to set the action plan, or do you have another take on that?
Well, the N and the D in NDC means, as you know, nationally determined, which means that nobody can impose anything on any of the countries, and they can all do as they like. So any opinion I might have about your question doesn't matter so much because they're all within their right to do as they like. And there are many differences between the different NDCs around the world. Having said that, if one wants to make a proactive, good contribution to climate mitigation under the Paris Agreement, it is very helpful if one is more detailed in one's NDCs and other Paris Agreement documents. Because the detail makes it forces the country itself to think through how it's going to get to places, how it's going to reduce emissions, like what is the pathway. So it forces it to plan and think through and reflect on the actual possible pathways. And it also creates the possibility for a commitment. So if a country says it'll do some detailed commitment, then it's maybe more likely to do that and can also be held accountable if it doesn't do that, or there's no punishment. It still be embarrassing. And the fear of that embarrassment may also be one reason why many ASEAN countries don't do it by sector and don't do it in such big detail, because they want it to be a bit inaccessible to avoid criticism.
I see. Thank you for Prof. Indra for your perspectives. And Talking about your recently published paper, the one that discussed about the public transportation, may I know what is your interest to bring up that topic as a research?
Yeah. Well, the first little thing to say is that it's very interesting to use the NDCs as a data source, because all countries in the world are part of the Paris Agreement and they all have some or other kind of NDC. So it's kind of a consistent empirical window to look at different phenomena. So that's one reason why we looked at this, at public transport in the NDCs. And then for the public transport part, why did we focus in on that? And that is because it is a climate mitigation area. It's not the biggest climate mitigation area, but it is one of them that has the greatest co-benefits, which are positive side effects of doing it. So when you implement public transport, you get many other benefits, like you get less congestion and queues in traffic because you get rid of a lot of cars with just one people in them. You get less pollution, both air pollution and also sound pollution. And I'm sitting in Jakarta now at ACE, and I can hear the thunder outside of the road, all the fossil fuel cars going by. So if that's shrunk, even if you stay in fossil fuels, if it's shrunk down to one bus instead of 30, 40 cars, that's a great incentive to do it. And another co-benefit is that it's good for the poor. It makes transportation, mobility more available for the poor. And it's good for kids because kids can't drive cars and they often can't afford or don't have access to the money to book taxis and so on. But they can take public transport, once they're a certain size. So there are so many co-benefits, so many positive aspects of public transport. Also creates jobs because you need drivers, you need maintenance of the infrastructure and so on. And with all these benefits, I find it strange that that it seems that people are not paying more attention to it, and that several of the mega cities of Southeast Asia were surprisingly weak on public transport, while having these major problems related to it, to congestion and air pollution. So I'm thinking places like Manila, which has once been crowned as the most congested city in the world. It certainly is very congested. And also Bangkok and Jakarta, for example, Ho Chi Minh City, they're all also quite congested. So those are also good reasons to look at this topic, I think.
But the process of constructing public transport or mass public transport is very, very long. So how do we align it with the timeline of greenhouse gas reduction or the timeline of net zero of ASEAN itself?
Yeah, it has been very, very long. For example, in Jakarta, where the MRT came 50 years late, and then when they finally decided to do it, it was also very slow and actually caused more congestion because they had to dig up all the roads. But that's maybe mostly a local problem. I'm not sure why it took so long. If you look at the Whoosh train from Jakarta to Bandung, that was built very fast. It has other limitations, but at least it was built fast by the Chinese. So yeah, infrastructure takes time to build, also costs a good bit, but it lasts forever. I mean, it has to be maintained, but once you've established those train tracks or bus stops or regional or urban public transit systems, if you keep maintaining them, you can keep them forever for hundreds of years. And I think Southeast Asia, 700 million people in an area which is not so big, and many of those people are concentrated in a few places, like Java Island, like the Luzon area around Manila, like Greater Bangkok, and so on, that it is a very, very logical place in the world to develop public transport, much more than a huge country like Brazil or Russia or Argentina, which have very large territories and not so many people, and thus it's difficult to develop public transport. Still, some of those countries are ahead of the Southeast Asian ones. But if you take somewhere like Java, it's so densely populated. There isn't space for everybody to have cars and motorbikes. And if you do efficient rail, relatively short distances most of the time, lots of people, little space. So with the rail, you can keep trains going all the time and you can move people around. So public transportation is super for the region, but somehow hasn't received so much attention.
Yes, and do you think that if we include, for example, if ASEAN member states include the sectoral basis, for example, like transportation basis, and specifically mention about the public transport as the part of reducing their greenhouse gas emission, would it be helpful for the ASEAN member states to solve the challenge?
Yeah, I think that could be helpful.
Interesting. And since you also mentioned the high-speed train, the Whoosh, previously, and yeah, I think you've heard about a significant debt from that is currently facing by the government. And given the relevant issue with the public transport and also its long term project planning, do you have any perspectives on how to prevent this from happening again in the future, especially for ASEAN member states, as it might affect the interest from the investors to support future projects?
Yeah, I think Indonesia has about a little bit over 7 billion American dollars in debt linked to Whoosh. That's a substantial amount of money. And it also doesn't have quite the passenger traffic that it would need to cover that debt. So there are many important lessons that Indonesia and maybe other countries can learn from that experience. And maybe one reason for the lack of passenger traffic is it doesn't actually go all the way to the center of Bandung, and it doesn't start from a central railway station in Jakarta either. So that was a certain design mistake or something that was allowed to happen because maybe it was very political and legally difficult to get rights of way for all the train tracks. But it's not something right now. Yeah. The thing about about infrastructure projects is they have very large capex, so you have to invest a lot of money when you start, but then they can last for hundreds of years. If you look at, like, say, the London Underground, which is one of the world's oldest undergrounds, or Moscow Underground, also very old. They last. Once you've dug those tunnels and laid those tracks, you need to maintain them and refurbish them, but they last forever. So those high costs that you have at the beginning pay back because you have an almost unlimited period. So from the perspective of a country or society or state, this is almost always going to be profitable. And the debts that Indonesia has, maybe the Whoosh was too expensive. I don't know, but I mean, $7 billion in Indonesia is a lot of money. But the interest rate is quite good. Most of the loan is at 2%, so it's a very cheap, it's an advantageous loan. And then there's a smaller part of the cost overrun, which is 3.5%. So that's a little bit less shiny, but it's still not so bad. So in the long run, this will probably still benefit Indonesia, and Indonesia probably needs more Whooshes and not less. And then, of course, first time you do something, there will always be unexpected development surprises, but one can learn from that experience, and I think there's a lot to learn from Whoosh.
So since it might be decreasing the trust of the investors to the country, and the donors often prefer like more bankable projects like electric vehicles or other projects, is there a risk that public transport remains underfunded even it's mentioned under the NDC?
it does remain underfunded, but it doesn't need to be. I think what's missing isn't so much capital, and I don't think they're not bankable. Public transport projects can be very bankable. They're very advantageous to society. They have usually a captive market, people who need to commute. Not 100% captive because they can also take motorbikes or cars, but at least the market is there. The transportation will happen one or another way. And they pay for it. Of course, you may want some kind of subsidies to some degree, but they do pay for it. So I don't see it as necessarily not bankable. I think it's rather that there has been a lack of interest in the governments of some countries to promote public transportation. There have been certain doctrines which come from the US from the 1950s about private car ownership and so on, which have become quite strong in Southeast Asia and aren't very helpful in terms of looking forward.
I see. And I think it's also related with where in many developing regions, the economy itself is closely tied to the sale, import, and also assembly of private vehicles. In a simple way, private cars makes more money to the country. So how does that affect the climate plans and also the public transport plan?
Yeah, I think that's true not just in Southeast Asia, but around the world. There are entrenched interests long existing, which have a kind of a path dependency. When you have, let's say you sell cars, fossil fuel, or now maybe electric more and more, but you have maybe a chain with several shops. The chain has its established lawyers which know the business well and other staff. It has certain relationships with countries and companies that it imports from. The customers know where the shop is. So that creates a lot of inertia. And the other one is that the people are used to driving, so they feel it's very convenient and so on. And they maybe don't realize always how easy it is to use public transport, especially now in the digital age, you can so easily say, I want to get from place A to B, and then Google or whatever will tell you exactly how to do that. So I think, and I think these entrenched interests, it's not just a problem in Southeast Asia, it's all over the world. And in the case of transportation, they've had a very damaging effect if you look at the automakers in Germany, who fought for a long time against electric vehicles, and certainly aren't friends of public transport, although Germany has quite good public transport, but it's weak on electric vehicles. And US, also big car companies, Japan also. So all these companies have been against electric vehicles and are presumably also not helping out much with public transport. But they also do immense damage to their own countries. So these companies like Toyota and Volkswagen and Ford and so on, they used to be huge industrial machines creating employment, creating profits, and creating exports. But they're all going to lose out. So yeah, they are entrenched. That explains many of the problems. But the sooner you can overcome that, the more likely that you escape from lagging behind these new opportunities. And I think it's very important here to think about these things not as a burden that, oh, this is expensive or difficult and so on, but to think of it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to develop new industries, jobs, business opportunities, at the same time as helping mitigate climate, and at the same time as improving or securing all these core benefits like clean air, noise pollution, congestion, traffic security, less accident, access for the poor, access for young, that's all.
And I think it is also important for the countries to have to explore more about their plan of public transportation in the future, for example, to create a roadmap. Or do you think it's necessary for ASEAN to create like a regional roadmap in terms of a public transport plan so that the member states could have a vision on the future public transport in ASEAN itself?
I think more initiative from ASEAN on public transport. I mean, there is some already, but even more and more enthusiasm and encouragement from ASEAN on public transport could be very helpful for many of the countries. it could maybe be in the form of a roadmap, depends on a little bit what kind of roadmap one has in mind. But the countries are so different, including in terms of their level of development of public transport, that you can't have a one size fits all. So like Singapore has very good public transport, whereas Jakarta and Manila have not quite as good public transport, as I experienced in the traffic jam coming here. So you can't have one roadmap or plan for those, but you could have some principles maybe, and you could have some general encouragement, and you could analytically, as we tried to do in this paper, try to point out to all other actors what these benefits are.
Yes, I think also since ACE also has a program and also just organized a workshop with the title Regional Workshop on Advancing Policy for Transport System Efficiency, it's also mentioned that ASEAN is on the way to integrate their planning and more reliable public transport operations and to create a more fuel efficiency for the transport itself. So I just want to let the audience know that, for example, Indonesia is currently pursuing a decentralized enablement model, prioritizing system integration and also more bankable delivery beyond the capital. And Lao PDR also prioritizing system integration on the transport sector. And Philippines are focusing on the fuel economy labeling for the transport and also charging targets for the electric vehicles. And also providing more station for development to anchor ridership. And Thailand, meanwhile, is currently executing a network build plus electrification, scaling urban and intercity rail, deploying electric buses, and piloting fuel economy standards. So I think it's yes, some of the ASEAN member states are currently finding their way to create an integrated transportation system in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions itself. So, Prof. Indra, do you have any recommendations for the ASEAN member states on how to boost up the project? Because when I read Norway's NDC, it mentioned that the Norwegian government way of supporting is from providing a financial scheme through Klimasat, if I'm not mistaken, and through the Klimasat, they provide and they funded low carbon technology or low carbon efforts projects to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Is it possible for ASEAN to apply the similar scheme like Norway to boost up their greenhouse gas reduction projects?
Yeah, I think so. Norway is a special case because Norway is a highly electrified country, and the electricity comes mainly from hydropower and secondly from wind. So it is a slightly different case, but I think also in ASEAN it's feasible and very attractive if the countries decide to go for this, which would be highly advantageous for them. So it's a great opportunity, which I think many European countries are leading on public transportation and have very pleasant cities built around public transportation, pleasant to be in and look at, and pleasant to move around. On the plan, so in the research where we're looking at the NDC, so this was published quite recently, but the research, of course, goes over some time. So we don't take into account any plans from the last couple of months. What we saw when we looked at the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement was that only 6 out of 10 countries had any targets or measures in the transport sector, and only 2.2% of all targets and measures in the ASEAN NDCs were related to transport. And that's being quite lenient in how we define things. So the real numbers may be even lower. So it simply hasn't been getting enough attention. And then you could say, we studied the NDCs under the Paris Agreement, but not, say, state and a national transport plan. Maybe it's there, maybe there's more there, and sometimes there is. But we're thinking that, well, if you really have sincere plans to expand public transportation, you probably want to put that in your NDC because it's a positive contribution to climate mitigation. So it's very, at best, it's paradoxical if they have plans but don't mention them in the NDCs, which most of them haven't been doing enough so far.
I see. So, do you think it's realistic to aim for regional public transport alignment, or, yeah, as you mentioned, is it a paradox for regional cooperation?
I think at some levels it is, and at some levels it isn't. I think the countries could inspire each other. They could show the way. Maybe they could compete, like a race to the top of public transportation. And if people could travel around, like now, you can go to Singapore and think, oh, the transportation is really good. This is very impressive. This must be nice for the people who live here. It's nice for me when I come to visit. Think along those lines. So if other countries see that possibility, it can also be a way of making your country and your cities attractive. And so not just a burden, but also an opportunity in that regard.
And you mentioned previously that ASEAN might be so attractive when it comes to like providing public transport or having the plan of mass public transport. Can you elaborate more on how attractive is ASEAN in terms of the public transport? Why do you call it attractive?
Well, the ASEAN countries, some of them are doing well, but several of them are very far behind. So I mean, like Jakarta and Manila really should have much, much more public transport developed 50 years ago. So in this sense, they're not attractive. On the other hand, in terms of developing new public transport, they're very attractive because there's a huge unfulfilled potential. So it's a big business opportunity for companies. And it's a big, and to improve those societies. And I think the previous question I didn't answer properly, which also links to another of your questions about this question of a more regional approach. So I think at some level it can work and some not. They can definitely inspire each other, get a better push, a race to the top. But then, of course, the countries are all very different. So you can't have like a blueprint that works some places. Some places laying a metro system underground may be very difficult because of the local geology, maybe all swampy, and so also make driving up prices. So maybe want to put them overground, like some of the countries have done. Whereas in other places you can go underground, which saves space. So there are many different options and needs, and also depending on how wealthy the country is, and so I think definitely there could be more common push and focus on public transport across the region, but not a blueprint, not a one size fits all.
All right, thank you, Prof. Indra. And I think we have received some questions here on the Q&A box. So maybe we can jump in to answer some first. The first one is asking that the paper mentions time inconsistency, but also notes that public transport can deliver quite visible near-term co-benefits. In practice, what are the main political or institutional barriers that still prevent decision makers from prioritizing public transport in their climate strategies?
I think it's just that they haven't thought about it, and there hasn't been so much attention to it globally. So it's not just a missing link in ASEAN, but around the world, especially outside of Europe, there just isn't that much focus on it. So I think that's this lack of attention and lack of awareness among decision makers is maybe the most important reason. I don't believe it's finance. It's certainly not technology. It's not lack of public support. It's not because it's publicly sensitive, like some things like energy subsidies, which people don't want to lose. So I think it's lack of political awareness mainly, and it's kind of a paradox because for many politicians, who when the MRT is finally finished in Jakarta area, if somebody gets credit for that, that'll probably be very beneficial for them. It's a nice, modern, mostly raised rail system. And if that's associated with some politicians, that's probably good for them. So it's an opportunity for them also to gain popularity, to do something for the public that's very tangible and that helps everybody.
Interesting. So, thank you, Prof. Indra, for your answer. So, I think we have some more questions here from Dr. Naes from Malaysia. So, the first one is, how can ASEAN overcome the energy security versus climate mitigations narrative that often delays low carbon transitions despite different development stages across ASEAN member states?
I think it's kind of a false opposition between energy security and climate mitigation. Many of the ASEAN countries have historically been fossil fuel exporters, but that has changed and continues to change. And they are becoming, the old importers are importing even more than before, so it's weighing down on their trade balance even more. Some countries are basically close to zero, but are going to become, or some countries have become, used to be net exporters, have become net importers. And finally, some countries are in the process of moving towards becoming net importers. So even a country like Indonesia, with huge coal reserves and quite a lot of gas, it's increasingly using that gas at home. It's still a net exporter, but it's moving towards zero. And after zero, it will go below zero, so become a net importer. So in that regard, and when you become an importer, energy security means that means that your energy supply becomes dependent on global markets. As both LNG and oil can be traded freely and transported around the world. So even if you say buy something from Australia, say LNG from Australia, if there's a war in Europe or the Middle East, that may affect the market for LNG, which will then maybe drive up prices for you. And same for oil. And in that case, your energy security is actually lower. So one of the great contributions to energy security is to produce energy from domestic resources, ideally clean resources. So I think people are beginning to see increasingly that renewable energy increases energy security. It has some slightly different challenges, but overall, the net of it is that it increases energy security. And it also improves your trade balance. So it's another big plus for it.
Yes, I think I agree with you where renewable energy also improves the energy security for ASEAN itself. And maybe it will also be related with the investment that is coming for the renewable energy projects or green projects in the ASEAN itself. And it also will be connected to the second questions that Dr. Nash asked on this session. That is, how can ASEAN maintain strategic autonomy while securing foreign investment needed for its energy transition? Perhaps you can share from EU best practices context.
I think, again, the key is political will. If there is political will, then it's possible to make frameworks that facilitate foreign investment. There's a lot of money available for investment in clean energy around the world, and ASEAN would be an attractive place to invest for many companies, banks, business people. But in most of the ASEAN countries, the framework, the conditions just haven't been attractive enough, stable enough, predictable enough for developing renewable energy. And one part of this is about feed-in tariffs, which guarantee certain prices for the early years, usually of a renewable energy project. And another is all the red tape, all permitting and so on. So that it's a problem, not just in ASEAN, but around the world. It's a huge problem, is the bureaucracy related to installing renewable energy. But if ASEAN manages to move forward on that, I'm sure it could attract a lot of capital.
I see. It's interesting how you mentioned political will is one of the aspects on how to leverage the project itself. So if I may ask you, so what's your intake on how to increase the political will itself? For example, to boost up the renewable energy or green or low carbon related projects for the country itself. So yeah, what is your perspective on that?
To boost the political will, we have to change people's minds, and doing podcasts is one of the ways of doing that. I don't know how big the impact of this podcast will be, but hopefully somebody will be influenced, some a little bit at least. But I think we need to get information out, scientifically based information, technologically informed information out, so that people can understand that importing a lot of fossil fuels is not good for energy security. Renewable energy is stable, it's intermittent but stable, and it has many advantages. And get these messages out, and then I think it's more likely that the politicians will follow, because the politicians, especially in democratic countries, but also in other countries, they're still influenced by the population. So we need to get it out to the population and influence them to influence the politicians.
All right, thank you, Prof. Indra, for your interesting questions and sharing session. I think there is no other questions here in the questions box. And since we have reached the ending of the questions and the sessions, I would like to really appreciate your time and efforts for being one of our next speakers here, sharing about the ASEAN energy and climate sector, as well as how the NDC translated the sectoral basis, for example, the needs of public transportations and how it will be implemented further in the countries itself. So thank you so much, Prof. Indra, for your time. Do you have any closing statements for this episode?
Just thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. I hope people will check out the article. There's a lot of information there that I didn't mention here, a lot of facts and interesting comparisons. And take the bus or the train or the MRT or whatever. It's nice. It's a way to see other people. It's cheap. It's clean. It helps keep the air clean and quiet and so on. So it's a great way to get around.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Indra, once again. And I will get back to Tanya.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Indira and Professor Indra, for the exciting discussion and valuable insights throughout the session. And thank you also to our audiences for your engaging questions. But before we conclude, I would like to invite both of you to a brief photo session. To Professor Indra and Ms. Indira, please be ready and give your biggest smile to the camera. I will lead the countdown. So 3, 2, 1. One more time, please. 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you, everyone. To our speaker, Prof. Indra Offerland, I would like to thank you for sharing your insights on the ASEAN transportation sector in the context of climate commitments. And to the audience, if you would like to read Professor Indra's paper, we have sent the link to the research paper in the chat box below. So that brings us to the end of today's ARNECC Live podcast. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We hope today's conversation brought fresh perspective to everyone joining us. Stay connected with us through our social media, newsletter, and website for more information on ARNECC and all things around ASEAN's energy and climate nexus. I'm Natania Azalia. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we hope to see you again at our next ARNECC webinars. Goodbye, everyone.